Welcome to 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act Virtual Pilgrimage. I'm your host, the Reverend John Borthwick, and it's my pleasure to be with you along this journey. If you've not watched the intro videos, I would encourage you to do that as a part of the playlist. The first video sort of talks about why we're reading through this book, 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act by Bob Joseph. And the second video talks a little bit about some terms that would be helpful for us to think about as we begin this pilgrimage together. I'm glad that you're joining me for this, and I'm glad we can take this opportunity to reflect each week on one of the things we may not have known about the Indian Act. So let's begin. Today, as we begin the journey with the first step, we look at the first thing, and the first thing is impose the elected chief and band council system. The Indian Act established this in 1869, and it still exists to this present day. Bob starts with a quote in this particular beginning, this chapter. It's from Prime Minister John A. Macdonald from 1880. And here's what John A. had to say. To wean them, indigenous peoples, by slow degrees from their nomadic habits, which have almost become an instinct, by slow degrees absorb them or settle them on the land. Meantime, they must be fairly protected. There's a lot in that one tiny quote that certainly speaks to the mindset, the intentionality, and the reason behind establishing within our parliamentary system, within our government, within the laws of this land of Canada, something called the Indian Act upon people who were here before the colonizers arrived. And so let's take a look at this first thing. And as I've said, part of what this is not a retelling of the book. I'm not attempting to read the book aloud to you. It's more about, here's my reaction to this first thing that I've read, and I'm also trying to make some parallels for the community that's joining me for this journey. So let's look a little bit at what this parallel might look like. So what they did in the Indian Act is basically said that there now needs to be a new form of government. And Bob is pretty clear, and if you've read your history, it is pretty obvious that before European contact, indigenous nations had many different ways of governing. They did it well. They sustained themselves as humans, probably just as effectively as we have. Probably some really positive things, maybe some negative things that they might have wished to change. But before European contact, this continent, this place that we now call Canada, certainly had all of its distinct traditions, leadership systems, economies, cultures, autonomous control over wide areas and regions, and interactions between other indigenous communities. In a vibrant way, people were living their lives and governing themselves just fine before contact came. But when through the Indian Act, the Canadian government basically dismissed all indigenous forms of government in favor of this European style of municipal government, it basically displaced, it replaced, and it certainly didn't create a consultative thing of, how would this work, or how would the community respond to this? This was not a consultative kind of process, as you can well imagine. And through the Indian Act, the Department of Indian Affairs, which exists today in a different iteration, I think we talked about what it's called now, but essentially the Department of Indian Affairs are the people who elect a chief and depose a chief. And just even that somehow the Canadian government is imposing who are going to be the chiefs and in charge of bands of indigenous people. Stunning that that's going on as a part of a process for autonomous individuals and groups of people who used to govern themselves quite well. And in the early days, was only men who got to vote, of course. Women were not given the right to vote until 1951 in Indigenous communities as a part of voting in the band. Now, also control of land, resources, finances, they were all controlled by the Department of Indian Affairs as well. The other issue related to all this is the way chiefs are elected is still quite problematic. The terms of some chiefs, as Bob outlines it, it seems like the terms that they use are quite short. There's a leadership change potentially every 2 years, which really can make it really difficult to make decisions and move things along. But just as I encourage you to read this part, this one thing of imposing an entirely different system of government, and you know, in a way, this is certainly what empires do. They come into a region and they say, this is the way things will be. They impose a way of dominating, controlling, and sort of managing the people that they've conquered. And certainly to change an entire governmental system is exceedingly problematic and disruptive to a people. And again, is likely intentionally so. But one thing it just triggered for me as I think about what's happening in the province of Ontario right now, where the provincial government is imposing something and putting into law a thing called super mayors just before an election. And it's interesting because it's basically changing a system in the midst of an election process. And in some ways, it's going to have significant impacts on the communities where super mayors are going to be allowed to function. They say it's going to be kind of a pilot, or they're going to experiment here, or they're going to try it and then expand it possibly. But it's just one of those things of, for some people, they feel like another government, another layer of government shouldn't be imposing a new kind of system upon communities. And you'll hear within the rhetoric around this conversation, a lot of people saying things like, it's not right for another government, level of government, to tell a municipality, a community, a city, how it should run itself. That should be the decision of the people. And as I put that alongside what Canada did by establishing the Indian Act and imposing a brand new system of government, a system of government that served the empire, or it served the Canadian government and its desires to have control of a system and a people, I just find that interesting for us to reflect on as we walk on this pilgrimage. That we would say out loud that we're concerned that another level of government shouldn't be telling us as people who live in a city how we should govern ourselves. And yet the reality of the Indian Act is, from the first thing, is that that's been the reality for well over 100 years. May we think on that today. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you again next time on 21 Things You May Not Have Known About the Indian Act, Virtual Pilgrimage.